It's been a while. There was a biography published about her, and I believe it was in the 80s, so it was a while back. And it was a feminist biography. The first name, I believe, of the biographer was Evelyn, and I would check, but I don't want to, break up the interview. And it was because it was a feminist biography, and she was very much looking at the choices and also what happened to women who wanted to do research. And so it really captured me. That's why it's really important, people can have lives that are almost, depending on who writes the biography, you almost don't recognize them. And I just appreciated that this was really looking through a feminist lens because it really resonated with me. And so she got on my radar that way. And it was all about, it was a real in-depth about what her studies in genetics, which was really lifting up diversity and also framing diversity as something that contributes. It's not like nature's mistakes. And of course, because Barbara was so different, gender nonconforming, and it appears she had lesbian relationships. She certainly had emotional intimacy with women, and there's no record of that with men. That I think that was part of her mission, was a deep sense of like, I don't see anybody like me, but I believe that the way I am is not a mistake or something I need to fix or hide. And so she was really tracking life and how genetic mutations and issues of diversity strengthen the gene pool and assure the survival of the species and so on. And now she is pretty universally accepted as having been on the autism spectrum. And we're seeing in real time Greta Thunberg, who is this huge child activist about global warming. And she got where she got because she's autistic. She's very focused. She has very supportive family. And she is not afraid to go to forums with world leaders and tell them, you are just wasting time. You are playing games. And meanwhile, the planet is being destroyed. And everybody's like, oh, she's so rude. She's so, and
Yeah.
I'm like, did you hear what she said? We're destroying, the sustainability of life on the planet. I think it's time to be rude, perhaps. Maybe we need a whole tribe of people who are fairly indifferent to what other people think about us. And I'm autistic also. And I have often felt that was a strength in my work. I didn't really care what people thought of it. And it was all about I'm following my vision, as Greta is following the thread of what it is that lights up her world, which is this environmental activism. And we cannot be dissuaded. And Barbara McClintock said it. If you know you're right, nobody will be able to pull you off track. And I think, well, if you're on the spectrum and you know you're right, nobody will be able to. Most people who are neurotypical will really backpedal and take a divergent path if they feel enormous social sanctions, disapproval, bad press. Most people care very deeply what other people think and will tailor their choices accordingly, which is how we got on this overheated planet in the first place. But I think Barbara was onto that. And she was like saying, when you see, and she also said, and I think this is close to a direct quote, when you see something you don't understand, you don't try to fix it or hide the data because it's going to make your study look bad. You follow it. You figure out, well, I didn't expect that result, but you know what? That is the result. Let me figure out what it means. And again, if you're bucking for tenure and trying to get promotion or published, you're kind of like, oh, that kind of undoes a whole lot of my previous research. So maybe I'll just omit it from the data or consider it a mistake. And she never did that. She was all about, when those things popped up, it's like, let's follow this. Let us sit with this until we can understand how it got here and what its possible evolutionary function is. So that attracted me. I did not know I was autistic at the time. This is about 30 years ago or more. I just knew I really want to write about this woman because I think her work is really important, and I think it's I think it's in tandem with her life. I think, as above, so below. These huge, epic understandings about the way life moves were actually playing out on a very personal level. That, for instance, she didn't care what she looked like. She wore men's clothes because they were practical and comfortable and cheap. So I love that in the microcosm of one person's life, she's echoing the enormous macrocosm of these cosmic sized studies that she was doing. I want people to know about this woman, and I want them to, I'm always reclaiming lesbians. Her relationship with Harriet Crichton was an extraordinarily intimate female friendship, and Harriet was one of the few people who understood her work. Often Gertrude Stein had one partner, Alice Toklas, who understood what she was writing, and everybody else is like, this makes no sense. And what you can do, even if there's just one person who sees what you're doing and who believes in you, is extraordinary. So I wanted to lift up that friendship, lift up same-sex intimacy. And I also, now, I finished the play before I understood she was autistic. And the year I finished it, I also was diagnosed as autistic. And I'm like, well, that's no wonder her life made so much sense to me. So I wanted to kind of put autism front and center, and also to show what it looks like trying to do intimacy across one partner's neurotypical, the other partner is autistic. And it's a really different trajectory. It's not like, they fall in love, there's some kind of conflict, it gets resolved, they move into the house with a picket fence and live happily ever after. When they realized their differences were so extreme, they didn't throw the friendship out. They were like, okay, this template, the picket fence thing, isn't going to work for us, but I love you dearly, you love me dearly, and I can track your work. And they found a way, they customized their intimacy to accommodate the fact that one was neurotypical and one was on the spectrum. And I feel very much that if you're loving, or even just in a friendship with somebody who's on the spectrum, it's important to recognize the models around you might not be appropriate. You might have to find your own way and just keep customizing what is good, what's endurable, what's sustainable here. How can we maximize that? And that's what they did. So it's a remarkable love story, and it crosses 5 decades. And not a lot of us can say that about our colleagues or our friends. Yes, there's 2 things she said. One was in reference to the men, and of course, she started her career in the 20s in Cornell, and the women were not allowed to do this, they weren't allowed to do that, they couldn't get research jobs, they couldn't get teaching jobs above the lowest level of associate or whatever, and they couldn't get the full professorships. And she faced huge discrimination throughout her life. And she said at one point, I can't compete with the men, and so I don't try. She just went her own way. She didn't try to elbow her way to the table. And that's one way to approach it. I mean, Shirley Chisholm was all about, if there isn't a chair for you at the table, bring a folding chair, And for her in that particular field, she realized I can spend massive amounts of time doing what I don't do well, schmoozing, trying to go to conferences, trying to figure out who's got the power, how can I get them to like me? And she knew she was no good at that because we don't read social cues well. I mean, being autistic, that is not our wheelhouse. And she was like, I'm not doing that. And then she realized I am going to be not invited to the party, publication-wise, profession-wise. And I'm just going to I have one life, I'm going to do it the very best I can and do my research with respect for the corn to the top of my ability. That's where my real relationship is. That's where I'm good. And that's where I'm going to put it all. So I can't compete with the men, so I don't try. It's very simple and concise. And there's a whole lot of loss and sadness in that. And it's not just women, it's people of color, people with disabilities. Often we can just look at it and go, lesbians, and just go, I felt like that in theater. I can't get into this game, and I can waste a whole lot of time and frustrate myself, or I can just keep doing what I do, what I love, what I do well. And maybe that will change, but maybe it won't. It's something I don't have control over. That was a role model for me. And the other thing she said, it's at the end of the play, is she talks about the great thing is to prevail. And prevailing is very different from winning, and especially when you're in a cultural minority and you're not invited at the party. And it means that it's different from winning. She did not, well, she did. They gave her the Nobel Prize in her 80s. All right, she won. That was the biggest prize you can get, and she won it. But at the end of her life, it wasn't like, oh my God, I'm so honored. It was like, yeah, this is 30 years too late. It was for work she'd done in the 50s that they had mocked her for. Yeah. So she was pretty like, yeah, there would have been a time for jumping around and popping the cork, but 30 years too late. I'm so past that work. That is like, it's like when somebody's talking about a play I wrote 40 years ago. I'm like, yeah, I think it's a good play. But right now, this is what I'm into. So the winning didn't mean much to her, and she was like, that she prevailed. She kept at it until the world grew up and was ready to see what she had to say about diversity, and particularly about genes and DNA. And she had come through hellish times. She came through the eugenics. She was in Berlin in the 1930s and had a complete breakdown and came home. They were taking her beloved field and using it to demonstrate the inferiority of races, and then to murder those people. I can't imagine the horror of realizing you're in that field and that this is what they're doing with it. And what should I do? Should I burn my work? Should I, what should I do? And that still haunts us today. We saw it raised its head in the civil rights era, racial inferiority and the DNA thing. She prevailed through all of that. And then, she prevailed in the understanding, which we have today, that environment influences the genes. It's not a code that's cast in stone, and that your great granddaddy and, all this, the genes are constantly interacting with the environment. Trauma that your grandparents have is going to show up in your DNA and your behaviors. And she was aware that everything is interacting all the time. You can't do that. And she prevailed and was proven right, and still there, still feeling good about her work. They didn't break her. And I think that is more of a victory than to actually win, is to see what they're doing to you. And I think of what the poet Lucille Clifton, African-American poet everyone needs to know more about. And she said, what they call you is one thing. What you answer to is something else. And they called her outdated, old-fashioned. Her results are inscrutable because they're the meanderings of postmenopausal dyke or whatever. They just really they dismissed her. They disrespected her hugely. She never answered to that. She just kept working, and then suddenly the world came to the knees and gave her the Nobel Prize. I love that. I just love that. Because we do have the power to not let them break us. There's not a lot we can do about huge amounts of the discrimination and the disrespect and the laws, but we cannot answer to it. We can choose not to be what they're calling us, and I love that.
Wow.
Well, the woman who wrote that biography did hang out with her and talk to her, and she was she's autistic. She was pretty much, I think that it would be a successful interview if I was up on her work and I could ask her specifics about it. But if I was asking her, like, how did you do it, or anything that I would want to ask, I suspect she would kind of give me this look and then look at the watch and be like, don't you have something better to do with yourself? Because that's kind of, autism. She's... we don't suffer fools kindly. But I think if I could be a fly on the wall, I would like to see what she did on those times when it got to her, because we all know constant rejection by your peers, ridicule. They couldn't understand her work and acted like that was her problem. It's like, no, that's because you're not smart enough and you're not where I'm at. I'm ahead of you. I'm not behind you. I'm ahead of you. That's why you don't understand it. But because she was an older woman, they didn't even make an effort. It's like, oh, Barbara, yeah. And how did she, I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall on some of those nights where there was a crushing loss during the day, another round of disrespect, another disinvitation. Oh, I'd like to see her in her moments of despair, because prevailing isn't just like everybody struggles who prevails and has dark nights of the soul. I would have liked to have seen her in the dark night of her soul. Did she call Harriet? Did she have, I know she wasn't religious, but she was deeply spiritual. I think she did Hindu practices. That's what I would, how did you do it? How did you keep throwing all of this off so that you could keep going? That would be my question. Well, I've had experience, when you're a playwright, you take liberties, and I think that might drive her crazy because she's a scientist. She would be all like, you made that up. And I'm like, yeah, isn't that great? That's my craft. And she would be like, and I have had, I've had families of dead lesbians who are like uncomfortable using that word. And their ancestor just had a roommate for 40 years who happened to be female, but we can't assume that was a same-sex intimacy. It was a roommate, and it is hard because, it's a play, and also obviously it was an intimate relationship. And so sometimes I veer away from the real life people because they're not happy with the liberties that you have to take to shape a narrative. Well, female friendship in these patriarchal systems, and we're talking about Cornell in the 1920s, it was, and then they were heading into the 50s when all the women were supposed to come home and keep house. They wrote out some pretty horrendously misogynist times, and that friendship was key. And a lot of times it's like, well, she never married, so she was just a spinster. And they did this to Rachel Carson, had intense lesbian relationships throughout her life. That were very related to her career. They were their agent and with a professor of hers. And, so it's annoying because it's sort of, if you didn't put a ring on it, it doesn't count. It's like, oh, it counts. And I don't believe that anything in her life would have been the same if it hadn't been for Harriet Crichton. I really don't. Having just one person, but just one person who sees who you are and is always there is absolutely key. And I don't think that relationship would have seemed significant in the eyes of someone who wasn't, in the LGBTQ community. I really don't. I would like to have them moved deeply, not manipulated. A lot of theater manipulates emotions, but moved deeply and seeing the thread, seeing her struggle with the autism and with being gender nonconforming and same-sex intimacy, and seeing how that relates to the anomalies, the things that were turning up in her genetic studies that nobody expected. That, well, this must be a mistake, or this is just, we don't understand why there's an accident or something, or it's your data. And to just realize that diversity is part of nature's plan. Greta Thunberg could save the planet, and only because she's autistic. She is not being responsive to all the social cues. You're only a child, you're a female, sit down, shut up, respect your elders. No. I feel like, I think we ought to maybe really revisit how we see diversity. But I'm hoping with going through the Depression and going through the horror of the 30s, with the rise of fascism specifically with this the eugenics thing. And then we have the civil rights movement where it raises its ugly head again. And the guy who discovered the double helix, which was James Watson, he said some horrendously racist things. And even later in life, it's like, dude, what are you doing with your field of study? I want them to see that through line of, all of that, and right up to what we're doing today. see how all of that ties together, and how important those of us who are really different and clearly never going to be conforming, to start looking at us through a different lens, like that might be incredibly valuable, the way that person is. Maybe I need to change. Maybe they don't. Maybe the culture needs to change. That's what I'd like for them to come away with. I'm so excited you're doing this. This is a world premiere. It's a world premiere. And the whole play takes place in a cornfield. I cannot wait to see how you handle that. I love that you believe in this play. I can't wait. And I feel very, very honored that you're doing the premiere of this. I want to lift up the theaters like Powerstories that are lifting up the voices of women. And I particularly, in this time that we're living in, where history seems just to be the History Channel, it's not really relevant to us, that you're lifting up, there's a lot of emphasis on the historical voices of women in that theater. These are really critical, really, really important. And I just hope everyone supports this theater and this production. But also, if you're in mainstream theater, ask, why are there no women playwrights in the season? You know, what can we do to get more women's voices at the table? It's terribly important. I love Powerstories has been extraordinarily supportive of me and my work, and I really appreciate them.